After the death of Herod the Great, his kingdom was divided among 3 of his 4 surviving sons. The division of his kingdom happened more or less according to the provisions of the last of his several wills. These wills had been changed throughout his lifetime, and several times just within the last weeks of his life. This will had to be ratified in Rome by the Emperor Augustus, and when it was, Herod's kingdom was divided thus. Archelaus received the territories of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. The territories on this map marked in red. The brother of Archelaus, Antipas, the famous Herod Antipas of the Gospel narratives, received the areas of Galilee and the disconnected territory of Perea in the Transjordan district as his tetrarchy. Philip, a half-brother of the aforementioned Herods, but the son of a different mother, received the territory of Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, Auronitis, and Iturea to the north. Just a point of confusion, or potential confusion, in the family tree of Herod. This Philip, who received the tetrarchy of those northern districts, is not the same Philip who was first married to Herodias. We just take a moment to trace this out. Herod Philip, also known as Philip, was a surviving son of Herod the Great, and he was a private citizen, which was probably the smartest course of action. He did not get involved in the politics of his father's kingdom. It was he who married Herodias, and out of their union came Salome, also famous from the Gospel stories as the one who danced before Herod Antipas, and who, at her mother's prodding, requested the head of John the Baptist as a prize. Herodias divorced this Herod at the same time that Herod Antipas divorced his first wife, a daughter of the king of Nabatea, Aretas, thus ending that fragile alliance between the Herodian family and the Nabatean ruler, and Antipas married Herodias. Oddly enough, the third of these tetrarchs ended up marrying the daughter of Herodias, ended up marrying Salome. One noteworthy feature of Rome's settling of Herod's will is that none of the heirs received the title of king. It was originally Herod's intent that Archelaus receive that title and be king of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but he was given the title of ethnarch, ruler of a people, instead. Antipas and Philip were given the even slightly less distinguished titles of tetrarch, ruler of a fourth part of a kingdom. Apparently, Archelaus was considered to have received about half. We should remember that the story of Herod and his family play themselves out against the backdrop of the story of Rome's emperors. Up to this point, we have focused largely on events in the reign of Augustus, the first of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Tiberius will become an important figure in the backdrop of the Gospel stories, of course, and Caligula, despite his short reign, will have some important impact on Judean affairs. Rome's empire had grown considerably since the time of Pompey's invasion. Well, that's the wrong word. Pompey's invited intrusion into Judean affairs. By the reign of Claudius, about 45 AD, Rome had in fact secured territories around the entire Mediterranean basin. It would continue to expand in Claudius's reign and thereafter north into Germany and eastward into Arabia, and eventually in the early 2nd century into Parthia itself. Judea and these other territories form a very small part of this empire, but a vitally important part, as they were part of this land bridge, as it were, between major holdings of the empire and the very important province of Egypt, which is frequently spoken of as the breadbasket of the ancient world. And in fact, Egypt, with its grain production, supplied Italy with the lion's share of Italy's grain. So the attention that Rome will give to holding Judea is probably more a signal of the importance of this land path to Egypt than a signal of how much Rome valued Judea in and of itself. Now, after Archelaus was removed from his ethnarchy for sheer incompetence after 10 years of mismanagement, Judea and Samaria and these related territories came under the jurisdiction of Roman prefects. These were Romans of the equestrian or below order, who ruled on behalf of the Syrian governor, I should say the Roman governor of the province of Syria, who in turn was answerable to the emperor. This return to direct administration by Romans was certainly not welcomed by many in Judea. Nevertheless, we don't have any clear signs of exceptional trouble during the early procurators, Coponius, Marcus Ambibulus, or Annius Rufus. Really, even under Valerius Gratus, it wasn't so much a time of peace, so much as a time of the lack of violent unrest and the lack of violent provocation on the part of these procurators. Things, of course, do change when a certain Pontius Pilatus, known simply as Pilate to English readers of the New Testament, was sent as the prefect of Judea and its environs. Pilate was less diplomatic than many of his precursors, and he was also more disposed to solve problems with violence than several of his predecessors. For example, when Pilate was first stationed in Judea, he, either in ignorance or apathy, stationed cohorts of the legion. He stationed cohorts in Jerusalem whose standards, whose symbols for the cohort, bore images of the emperor. This, of course, put graven images of human beings who were also known to be worshipped empire-wide as gods, in the holy city itself, and eventually Pilate had to replace those cohorts with others under protest. Pilate thought he was doing Jerusalem a favor when he constructed a new aqueduct to increase the water supply to the city. But because it was a public work on behalf of the city, he confiscated funds from the temple treasury in order to finance it. Of course, confiscating funds from the temple treasury was regarded as an act of sacrilege, and significant protests were raised in response. Luke, at the beginning of his 13th chapter, shows us Jesus remembering a certain group of Galileans whose blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices. We don't know much about this episode, but it hints at Pilate dealing with a group of Galilean pilgrims to Jerusalem violently, killing them as they were approaching the temple, or even as they were in the temple itself. There is some indication of an insurrection under Pilate. Barabbas comes to be in prison and in custody at the time of Jesus' trial, according to at least one of the gospel writers, because of an insurrection in Jerusalem, or perhaps somewhere in Judea. When Pilate was suspicious of a group of Samaritan pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, when he thought that they might have some revolutionary purpose, I probably just misspoke. Probably Samaritan pilgrims going to their own sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. When he suspected this traveling group of some revolutionary purpose, he intervenes with military might and slaughters them. It's this final act that eventually got Pilate recalled to Rome and removed from the administration of Judea and Samaria. So procurators like Pilate rubbed the Judean and Samaritan population the wrong way in some major ways, increasing the sense of hostility against Rome and resentment of this direct Roman rule. A change in administration began to happen about this time as we consider the rise of Herod Agrippa, the first by that name. Herod Agrippa was in fact a grandson of Herod the Great, but he was also a near contemporary of Archelaus and Antipas, perhaps a somewhat younger contemporary of these figures. This is because, of course, Herod's children by Mariamne came along considerably earlier than Herod's children by his fourth wife. Agrippa was the son of Aristobulus, who was one of the two sons of Mariamne that Herod had executed. Nevertheless, this Herod rose to power under his good friend Gaius Caligula. Agrippa had been sent to Rome to be educated, perhaps as a kind of friendly hostage. It's very frequent that client kings would send members of their family to Rome, where they lived wonderfully, but they were also close on hand to guarantee the loyalty of the distant client king. Herod Agrippa made an offhanded comment at a dinner banquet to his friend Gaius, who came to be known as Caligula, to the effect of, wouldn't it be great if your nasty old great-uncle Tiberius died and you became emperor? This careless comment was reported to Gaius's great-uncle Tiberius, and Agrippa, as a result, was put in prison by the sour emperor. However, just a year later, Gaius's nasty old great-uncle did die under highly suspicious causes. Every historical source in the period attributes it to murder, Tiberius being murdered in his bed at the behest of Gaius, who then succeeded him as emperor. With the accession of Gaius, Agrippa is released from prison and is given the territory of Philip, along with the title of king. So Herod Agrippa returns, actually he stays in Rome for a little bit longer, but eventually returns to the northern territories of Judea, where he is now a Herod, again with the title king. 2 years later, Herod receives the territories of his, well, I can't quite figure out the relation, but of Herod Antipas. The backstory there is that Herodias was jealous of her brother Agrippa. Herodias and Agrippa were brother and sister. Herodias was jealous that Agrippa had the title king, whereas her own husband Antipas was merely still a tetrarch. So she urged her husband Antipas to petition Gaius Caligula for the same title that Agrippa enjoyed. All this won for Antipas, however, was suspicion on Gaius's part, perhaps prompted by words from Agrippa to the effect that Antipas is looking to cause trouble and create insurrection and create an independent kingdom. And the result was that Herod Antipas was removed from his territory in 39 AD and exiled probably to Gaul. To her credit, Herodias is remembered as going into exile with her husband, rather than seeking another divorce and remaining in her territory. Agrippa now has the northern territories as well as Galilee and Perea. And in 41 AD, Agrippa received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, as Gaius removed the last Roman governor, the one who had succeeded Pontius Pilatus, and increased his friend Agrippa's kingdom considerably. Now, there's a story about Caligula that merits some attention here, because again, it probably contributes greatly to Judean dis-ease with Roman rule. Gaius, one of the reasons cousins shouldn't marry, had already begun to think of himself as a god and not merely a human being. Emperors were typically modest and realistic in this regard. Augustus, Tiberius, they knew they were just super powerful men, not divine. Caligula crossed a line and actively promoted his own worship. This led to occasions of anti-Jewish actions. For example, in the city of Alexandria, the non-Jews there took advantage of the new kind of impetus toward emperor worship to get the Jews there in trouble by installing images of the emperor in their synagogues, which of course defile the synagogues but put the Jews in a terrible bind because they couldn't remove the statues of the emperor without committing sacrilege against the emperor's image, against, the deity of the emperor. Something similar happened in the territory of Israel in the town of Jamnia, where the non-Jewish residents set up an altar and a statue to the emperor. But the Jewish residents, believing this to be inappropriate in that territory, tore down the altar and got rid of the statue. This, of course, was an act of sacrilege against the emperor, and this might have been the precipitating factor in Gaius's decision to install a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, making it, in part at least, a shrine of the imperial cult. It was only the wise delay of the governor of Syria, Petronius, that prevented all-out massacres of Jews by Roman soldiers eventuating, because, of course, the Jewish population, the Judean population, was not going to tolerate such a desecration of the temple. And some, of course, would have opted right there for armed revolt. Others made it clear that they would prefer to be killed en masse. A delegation from Judea stopped the procession of a statue on the way from Syria, kneeling in the road before the governor and pulling back the clothing from around their necks as if to signal, obviously, just kill us now if you're going to go on with this. So Petronius delayed, used what tactics he could to delay as best as he was able. Agrippa was able to intervene with his old friend Gaius, dissuading him from pressing this particular issue. Whether or not they truly would have dissuaded Caligula, or he would have eventually pushed back, was forestalled by the assassination of Caligula in Rome by his own bodyguard. Back to Agrippa, he only got to enjoy his enlarged kingdom for a few years. Both Acts 12 and an account in Josephus tells of how he died very shortly after giving an address in Caesarea by the Sea in 44 AD. And he does appear to have died of a terrible infection of his gastric region. After the death of Agrippa I, the territories of Judea and Samaria fell back under direct Roman administration, this time at the level of procurators, all of whom came from the equestrian class, that is to say, the class just below that of Roman senators. The first few of these procurators appear not to have provoked the people under their charge. In fact, Tiberius Julius Alexander was himself an apostate Jew, but apparently put his Jewish knowledge to good use during his term as governor here. And indeed, he was rewarded for his service here with the more desirable post of governor of Alexandria, whither he returned after this after this term here. Cumanus, under Ventidius Cumanus, there were some unfortunate events. One of them was just completely stupid. One of the soldiers under Cumanus's charge provoked a bunch of Jewish pilgrims during a major feast as he stood guard over the temple by turning and exposing his backside to them and making a loud flatulating noise. This, of course, provoked loud protests from the crowd that had gathered, and instead of punishing the soldier, Cumanus treated the protesters as agitators and unleashed his soldiers upon them, massacring them in the temple precincts. It was also under Cumanus that there were some hostilities between Jews and Samaritans when some Galilean pilgrims making their way to the temple through Samaria were murdered in Samaritan territory. The failure to deal with this effectively on the part of Cumanus led to a serious upsurge in anti-Roman sentiment. In fact, the way the Romans dealt with it was to flog and crucify both Judean and Samaritan leaders, which made Roman justice no doubt seem terribly arbitrary. Cumanus was recalled as a result of these troubles that fomented under him. And this is when Antonius Felix becomes governor of this region. And we know the name Felix from Acts. It was under Felix that Paul was arrested and eventually transferred to be held in the the praetorium of Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea, which was the chief base of operations for the Roman prefects and later the Roman procurators. The palace that Herod had built right on the sea became the governor's palace when Roman administration of the province began. Felix did achieve some success in the province. He focused on routing bands of brigands that were terrorizing the countryside, as did his successor Porcius Festus, who is also known from the Acts narrative as the one under whom Paul appealed to Rome and who indeed sent Paul on to stand trial in Rome. The last two governors created greater trouble for themselves by their treatment of the Jewish people under their charge. It was under Albinus, by the way, that the work on the temple was finally completed, ironically just a few years before its complete destruction. Gessius Florus was the worst, those dates should read 64 to 66 AD, was the worst of all. And we'll talk about his action shortly as we consider the outbreak of the Jewish revolt. We should give some consideration to the last King Herod. This was Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa II was, predictably, the son of Herod Agrippa I. Agrippa II had two sisters. One, known in English as Bernice, in Greek more like Berenike, and another named Drusilla. Drusilla, as it happens, had married Antonius Felix while he was the procurator of the province. And Berenike had married Herod of Chalcis, who appears on the family tree here as Agrippa I's brother, so that Berenike married her uncle, but Herod of Chalcis would soon die, and this would position Herod Agrippa II to receive the small kingdom of Herod of Chalcis shortly thereafter. He was still a minor. Agrippa II was still a minor when his father had died in 44, and so he had not succeeded to any of his father's territories immediately. But just a few years later, he begins to appear as a reigning figure when he inherits that small kingdom from his uncle and brother-in-law. Ancient families, Herod of Chalcis. In the early 50s, his kingdom would be expanded as he was granted Philip's old territories, hence Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, and Iturea. Misspelling there, my bad. Iturea. And Herod Agrippa II made Caesarea Philippi, that is Philip's Caesarea, this city called Caesarea in the Northern Territory, his capital, and would eventually build a magnificent palace there, the remains of which can still be seen. In the late 50s, Herod Agrippa II's territory was expanded further to receive a number of the cities and territories around the Sea of Galilee. And Herod Agrippa II would become and would remain a staunch ally of Rome during the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD. He was always to be seen either entertaining the general Vespasian and his son Titus, or giving them counsel in their war tent, or appealing to the residents of Jerusalem to surrender while there was still a chance of survival. So we come at last to the first Jewish revolt of 66 to 70, although in some respects we should say 66 to 73 AD, an all-out revolution against Roman rule in the territories of Judea and Galilee and some related territories. Samaria appears not to have participated in the revolt, and of course the Decapolis, as a group of largely Gentile Greek cities, would have none of it. So we're looking primarily at territories in Galilee and Judea. There were, of course, strong ideological motivations for revolt. God is our king. This land was promised to us. We cannot have Gentiles dominating us again. We can follow in the footsteps of Judas Maccabeus, who led the faithful in a successful revolution against staggering forces under the Syrian kings Antiochus IV and his successors, and successfully set up a native dynasty. Alongside that, there were practical reasons or practical causes for the revolt. One of the frequently overlooked problems in Judea and Galilee was the immense divide between rich and poor, between the propertied classes and the displaced classes. One of the first acts of the revolt was to burn all the records in the Jerusalem temple of debt and of land ownership, thus creating a kind of jubilee year in terms of in terms of debt, and a completely clean slate in terms of potential for ownership, kind of erasing those divides. And of course, the revolt was in large measure provoked by bad Roman administration, particularly in Judea. We've already seen some examples of this, and there's actually a long string of precursors to the revolt that finally broke out in 66 AD, going all the way back to the time close to Herod's death. Herod had decorated one of the entrances to the temple with a great golden eagle, which, in retrospect, one just has to say was a stupid move, because he had to know how the natives would respond to a graven image right there over the gate of a temple. So as Herod was ailing, a number of Jewish teachers led an act of revolution by getting a bunch of people together to pull down and destroy this sculpted eagle, which was also, of course, a symbol of Rome. Needless to say, all those involved were rounded up and punished, I believe, by being burned alive. There were also revolutions in 4 BC, after Herod's death, but before the will of Herod had been confirmed in Rome. Uprisings that had to be suppressed by the Syrian legate Varus, whose troops ended up crucifying 2,000 some revolutionaries. There were revolutionary reactions against the census that was taken in 6 or 7 AD, when the territory of Judea ceased to be under the rule of a Herod, under the rule of Archelaus, and came under the direct rule of a Roman administrator. There was that insurrection sometime under Pilate that landed Barabbas and others in prison. There was some revolutionary movement led by the sons of another revolutionary, Judas the Galilean, who were crucified around 47 AD. Under Antonius Felix, a movement emerges, terrorists known as Sicarii, because they would hide their daggers under their cloaks, and they would strike at a signal, kill Roman collaborators in a crowd, and then disappear immediately, blend right back into the crowd, so no one felt safe. There was an Egyptian Jewish prophet who came gathering thousands, promising to lead them into a new era by parting the Jordan and leading them into the promised land again, a group that was dispersed by Roman troops. There were riots in Caesarea and elsewhere between the Jewish and non-Jewish populations of those cities. So many stirrings of revolt. But under Gessius Florus, that last governor, that last procurator of Judea, a number of things happened that just tipped the scales toward full-scale revolt. For one thing, he confiscated 17 talents from the temple treasury to pay alleged arrears in Judea's taxes. He took a bribe of 8 talents from the Jewish community in Caesarea in order to get his intervention for some serious injustices against the Jews in Caesarea, which he then never followed up upon, but instead brutalized the very people whom he was supposed to help. When insulted, he took the unprecedented step of flogging and crucifying Jews who also possessed Roman citizenship. He did, in fact, seem bent on provoking the province into rebellion, and Josephus, who of course, can't be trusted in all things, but does have some, at least the potential for first-hand insight into these situations, suggests that his crimes were so great that he figured he could only cover them up by stimulating worse crimes, namely by goading the population into rebellion, so that in the suppression of the rebellion, no one would think to investigate Florus's own crimes. Rebellion did, in fact, break out in a number of ways. Rebel forces, zealot forces, concentrated on capturing the fortresses in the area. Thus, very quickly, they took hold of Masada and Herodion and the fortress Machaerus on the east bank of the Dead Sea. And these fortresses would remain kind of bases of operation for revolutionary armies throughout the revolt and for years after. The captain of the temple in Jerusalem ordered the cessation of the sacrifices that were being offered on behalf of the emperor as a token of loyalty. About this time, there were massacres of Jews in Gentile cities in the region, while the country as a whole was mobilizing for all-out revolt. Very early, the governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus by name, moved in an uncommitted attempt to regain control of the area, and the early defeat of the forces of Cestius Gallus gave great confidence to the revolutionaries that God was fighting on their side and would grant them, like Judas Maccabeus, another tremendous victory against unfathomable odds and restore the kingdom to Israel. Nero sent the general Vespasian and a decorated war hero, in effect, to take command of the legions in Syria, to bring auxiliary legions from Alexandria, and to take charge of the problem in Judea and Galilee. That story is well worth reading for all students of the New Testament, or for students of first century Judea. Josephus' Jewish War, especially in a modern translation, reads like an historical novel. It's a fabulous window into this period. To tell the story briefly, Vespasian first concentrates on the region of Galilee and suppressing revolutionary activity there, which he apparently achieves within the space of a year, and then begins to pacify Judea and Idumea, which he's able to do with great efficiency. Something happens, though, in the Roman Empire that causes Vespasian to pause his pursuit, his prosecution of this military action, and that is the eruption of all-out civil war once again, such as had not happened in the Roman Empire since Octavian defeated Antony in 31 BC, a full century before. The occasion for the civil war was largely dissatisfaction with Nero. Nero did in fact commit suicide in 68 AD, but prior to that, the legions in the West had already taken action, revolutionary action against Nero by proclaiming their general, an old and simply a really nasty human being named Galba, proclaiming him as emperor. And Galba, very happy to accept this nomination, began to move his troops eastward toward Italy to remove Nero's administration and install his own. Nero, hearing of Galba's advance, knows how things are going to go, so he kills himself. Galba is established as emperor, but he doesn't have the support of everyone. He doesn't have the support of the Senate, who nominate instead a senator named Otho. And Galba doesn't have the support of the legions in Germany, who nominate their own general, Vitellius, to become emperor after Nero. And so we find the forces of Galba fighting those forces that will support Otho, who eventually emerges victorious very briefly. Technically, Galba enjoys the emperorship for about 6 months, Otho for about 2 months. Otho is in turn defeated by Vitellius, who enjoys being emperor for just a few months himself, while Vespasian is acclaimed emperor by his own troops in Alexandria. So Vespasian takes the majority of his legionary support westward to encounter the legions that support Vitellius, the last survivor of these three. And as it happens, Vespasian emerges as the last man standing, and he is acclaimed emperor, and he does gain the support of all survivors. And in part, it's because he has two strong, strapping sons, Titus and Domitian, who are likely to provide for an orderly succession after Vespasian. So we have the welcoming of a new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. With matters, frankly, of much greater moment settled in Rome, Vespasian turns his attention back to the Judean revolt, and he sends his son Titus to take command of the final stages of suppressing this revolt. So Titus, with the legions of Syria and Alexandria, lays siege to Jerusalem. And we should also mention at this time that the revolt itself has been hindered by factionalism among the Jews from the beginning. If you were to read Josephus's Jewish War, you'd see how factionalism in Galilee was at work, with one leader eroding the support and resources of another. This factionalism continues in Jerusalem, again weakening the entire war effort as these factions turn against each other within the city while it is besieged. Titus waits for months, having put a wall around the city, a wall of army camps and a literal wall, a circumvallation, so that no one can escape undetected. And he allows factionalism and starvation to weaken the enemy as much as possible before he breaks in and breaches one wall after another in the city of Jerusalem, till finally he besieges the last faction of rebels in the temple and the upper city. There are doubts as to whether or not Titus himself wanted to destroy the temple or wanted to leave it and preserve it if at all possible. But the progress of the revolt made it impossible to consider trying to spare a piece of architecture, because it was also a stronghold of one of the major rebel factions. So the temple itself went up in flames, and shortly thereafter the upper city. And this brought an end to the major revolutionary factions. Evidence of the first revolt is still quite apparent in Jerusalem. For example, along the southern wall, the part of the southern wall of the temple enclosure, one can see the damage done to the road beneath as Titus's soldiers tore down the fortifications around the temple. Not the temple itself at this distance, but the fortified wall surrounding the temple's courts, just throwing a huge Herodian block after Herodian block, blocks about 4 feet long in one dimension, down to the pavement below, breaking it up, in fact denting it a bit below street level, maybe a foot or 2 feet below street level in the process. One can see etched into the huge limestone blocks the results of the wooden structures that were set up against the temple, the wooden shops and buildings resting against the temple foundation wall, as those went up in flames during the siege. Limestone is one of those few stones that actually can burn, so the damage is etched permanently in there. Archaeological excavations in the Jewish quarter have turned up mansions that were destroyed by fire during the taking of Jerusalem. Some cypress timbers that once supported a roof of a mansion, and fire damage on frescoed, plastered walls. The successful suppression of the Jewish war is also prominently celebrated across the Roman Empire. A great embarrassment, a great degradation to the Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire. For example, a triumphal arch was constructed to honor Titus for his victory. Carved within this arch are 2 impressive scenes from what would have been Titus's triumphal procession after he returned to Rome with the spoils of war and with prisoners in tow. And of course, it is one of these panels that shows us the famous menorah taken from the temple, as well as a table and trumpets, part of the sacred accoutrements of the Jerusalem temple. The other panel shows Titus himself being drawn in a 4-horse chariot, and then the figure of winged victory behind him, holding a wreath over his head. It's thought that the goddess Roma is portrayed leading the 4 horses by the reins. Coins issued commemorate this event. Vespasian is frequently featured on the obverse of coins bearing the legend Judea capta, Judah or Judea taken. The revolt ended. And here we find Judea portrayed, personified, as a woman seated beneath her palm tree, the date palms that are so emblematic of the region, in mourning for the defeat. This image shows the Emperor Titus, so this is minted after 79 A.D. Vespasian is emperor from 69 to 79, Titus from 79 to 81. On the back of this coin, we see victory, hanging Roman shields on a palm tree. Again, recalling 10 years later, Titus's part in protecting the Roman Empire by suppressing this revolution. Other images show the deified Vespasian. This is a posthumous issue in Vespasian's name, with Roma Victrix. Victrix is the feminine equivalent of victor. Rome victorious. Obviously over what? Over Judea, the only military triumph that the Flavians could claim. And coins celebrating the Pax Augusti, very common reverse. Of course, we're reminded that the Pax Augusti exists because of Roman conquest and retention of its territories, including those territories that dearly would like not to be part of the Roman Empire. Another issue of Titus shows Judeans as suppliants before the Emperor Titus. So coins like this throughout the reigns of Vespasian and Titus keep the memory of this victory from the perspective of Judea, this terrible defeat, alive and before the eyes of all. Something significant happens to the temple tax after 70 A.D. As you may be aware, Jewish males of a certain age contributed half a shekel annually to the upkeep of the temple and to the subvention of its daily offerings. And in this way, all Jewish males of a certain age participated in the offering of those sacrifices. After the successful suppression of the Jewish revolt, Vespasian decided that Jewish males of now expanded ages would continue to pay this temple tax, except now the temple tax would not go to restoring the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, but it would go to the renovation of the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill overlooking the Roman Forum. And so Jews purchased their peace, in effect, by paying this per capita very small penalty, but ideologically speaking, a huge penalty, because they were now required, literally, to render to Caesar, and for Caesar's purposes, what belonged to God, the God of Israel, who had been worshipped in the Jerusalem temple. And insult of insults, this tax would now go into the rebuilding and beautification of a pagan temple, and to the support of the sacrifices offered there to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Rebels remained in charge of several strongholds in Judea, and so the years 71 through 73 were spent in cleanup operations. The governor, the military governor appointed after Titus pulled out, Lucianus Bassus, was in charge of this, and he first focused on the fortress of Machaerus, which is just to the east of the Dead Sea in present-day Jordan, and he besieged the fortress and lower city of this stronghold, eventually winning it and moving on to Herodium, which had been taken also by the revolutionaries, and besieging and taking that in 73. He died in office and was replaced by Lucius Flavius Silva, who was left as military governor and pursued the last fortress, Masada, the most famous holdout of the Zealots and Sicarii, technically the Sicarii, in the Jewish war. And of course he took Masada famously by setting up siege camps around the entire place. This is, I think, the major siege camp, but others can be seen, 14 I think in total, around the entire perimeter of Masada, and building a siege ramp over top a natural debris deposit where the hill had been degrading. You can see how these rocky outcrops leave debris fields all around. This was the most promising, and Silva was able to build a ramp up to the ramparts and break through, taking the camp. The story goes that the residents on top all agreed to deprive the Romans of their final victory by committing suicide together. A suicide that would actually be carried out by consensual murder, so that really only one person would be guilty of suicide, but rather zealots would kill their families. A group of 10 was chosen to kill the zealots, the other zealots, their fellow zealots, and one was chosen to kill the 10, and finally to kill himself. We will, of course, never know the degree to which consensus on this plan was reached, but it was certainly carried out, with 10 killing the remaining survivors and finally being killed by the one. These lots have eerily been found at Masada. Not much is known about the history of Judea after the fall of Masada, during the reign of the Flavian emperors, or the adoptive emperors that succeeded Domitian, the aged senator Nerva, the brilliant general Trajan, whom Nerva adopted as his successor. But we do learn more about conditions in Judea and events in Judea under Trajan's successor, Hadrian. It was under Hadrian that the Jews attempted a second revolt against Rome, under the leader of a certain Bar Koseba, who was nicknamed Bar Kokhba, son of a star, hence a messianic figure. This coin, incidentally, shows probably the facade, the imagined facade of the Jerusalem temple, which no doubt Bar Koseba hoped to rebuild after his successful revolt against Rome. Hadrian, of course, would have none of that, and he was personally present in Judea for much of the revolt, and his legions, predictably, did suppress the revolt, and as a consequence, Hadrian took the very serious step of refounding Jerusalem as a Roman city for non-Jews. Jews were in fact not allowed to enter the city limits anymore. The city limits not of Jerusalem, but of Aelia Capitolina, the city renamed for Hadrian's family, the Elias line, and for in honor of Capitoline Jupiter, who was worshipped in a temple built over the Temple Mount, so that the sacred space of the Jews became the sacred precincts of Jupiter Capitolinus, Jupiter the god also worshipped on the hill behind the Roman Forum. And this change of city name and this temple is commemorated on several coins. One from the period, this is Hadrian, and this one is from the later Antonine dynasty. One can still find traces of Aelia Capitolina throughout Jerusalem. The pavement in a certain convent in the northeastern quadrant of Jerusalem, which is touted as the pavement on which Jesus was judged, but in fact is a pavement of a forum laid by Hadrian as he refashioned this city. Portions of a courtyard and temple from Hadrian's time remain in front of, and actually embedded within, the famous Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One can also find remnants of gateways into the city that were built as triumphal arches in Hadrian's time. This gateway is underneath the modern Damascus Gate, a major entrance into the north side of Jerusalem, but originally a gate very much like this one from Jerash, also erected in honor of Hadrian's victories in Judea. Once stood on this site, and this passenger entrance corresponds to this discovery below the Damascus Gate. And thus finally, the second Jewish revolt resulted not in Judean independence, but just the opposite, the utter desecration, from a Jewish point of view, of the holy city itself.